Happy, is it Happy Social Work Month? I don't know. What is the right way to introduce a whole month that's dedicated to social workers? I'm glad it exists. So thank you very much for inviting me. This is just a short talk to share kind of some of the lessons learned, some of the things we've learned these 2+ years of journeying together through the long pandemic, working with our clients, really during a very, very challenging time. So let me just say, first of all, so some of the things I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be going in a kind of an untraditional direction for a talk to a bunch of counselors, clinicians, and social workers and stuff like that. And that I'm not going to be talking about clinical research as much as I'm going to be talking about my readings in world literature and what I've learned from other people who have triumphed and learned from adversity, and kind of what the applicable lessons learned might be that we can take from those. I did want to say a little bit about my relationship with Providence Health Systems, because it's a strong and it's a positive one. So I don't remember if I told Sarah this, but when Sarah reached out to me and asked me to do a little talk for Social Work Month, it was the night before I was scheduled to have my hip replaced at a Providence Ambulatory Plaza Surgery Center. So it seemed like an auspicious thing to say yes. Yes, I will. Yes, I will. I will do this talk. And one thing that was confirmed yet again by my surgery experience at Providence was just the consistency of the high quality professional relationships I experienced. I just always, and I'm not just saying this because you guys invited me today, but I just always experience at Providence that people really care, that they're sensitive to the anxieties of patients during kind of difficult times, to my anxiety and my worries during a difficult time. I was just so impressed by the warmth and the goodwill and the humor that people brought. When I went home after I talked to Sarah, and I went home and I mentioned it to my spouse, she reminded me that all 3 of our children had been born at Providence, Portland. And again, I sort of recalled fond memories of good humor and the expertise of nurses and midwives, and just remember being shown how to wrap a baby up like a burrito. And for some reason, I have very strong memories of the fruit juice machine at the paternity unit. So anyway, so that's one of the reasons why it feels very special to me to kind of be talking to all of you. So this pandemic's now, it's stretching into its 3rd year, right? And helping professionals like all of you, like me, we're all feeling the effects. We're not just feeling it in our own body, we're feeling it in our relationships with the people that we help. We're seeing more divorces, we're seeing more relapses, we're seeing depression and anxiety that are worsening and heightening. And my usual go-tos for practice wisdom, so I would usually be going to the literature on the neurobiology of toxic stress and mindfulness, or maybe I'd be looking at practice models that address overwhelm and trauma. Those all kind of fall short for me. And I found myself exploring the work of wise writers, big souls, mentors from the past, who distilled their own creative endurance strategies from other periods of upheaval, whether those were personal or global. So much of our work as counselors and therapists and social workers is focused on building particular skill sets with our clients. But for coping with the long-term effects of this pandemic, we're actually engaged at a deeper level in a more personal meaning making. When I considered where I had gotten endurance strategies over the past 2 years, I immediately thought of 2 books that I have read and reread many, many times. And I thought it would be helpful to share the stories of these 2 writers to give us some ideas about how we might endure. Now, their experiences and what they went through, the adversities that they faced, they're not pandemics. Very different from what we're going through. They come with different life experience, different social locations. but they were trying to articulate something about how human beings navigate suffering. And I think that there's something applicable in that we can learn. Audre Lorde was identified as a Black, lesbian, mother, activist, warrior, and poet. I read the cancer journals in 1987, interestingly, the height of another pandemic, the AIDS crisis. Later, between cross-country moves, I lost my copy of the cancer journals, and then, interestingly, the book went out of print for a number of years, and that's, of course, not an uncommon fate for many Black and Indigenous and authors of color. Coincidentally, in 2020, Penguin Classics reissued the cancer journals with a new introduction by Tracy Smith. And I wondered, well, what would she say? What would she have to say now about how we're enduring this current period of the world turning upside down? The Cancer Journals chronicles her harrowing experience of diagnosis, mastectomy, and recovery in 1978, a very, very different era. 6 years after that, she found out that the breast cancer had metastasized into her liver. And so cancer and the mortal specter that it brings into someone's life was a constant in the last years of her brilliant writing career. She was acutely conscious of the fact that the emotional experience of breast cancer was not honestly discussed, especially as it emerged for queer women of color, and she devoted herself to filling that void. And I love this, the language here is so beautiful, still shaken but much stronger. I love the paradox that she holds right there, that we can be both things at the same time. I'm so tired of this. I bet we can all relate to that, right? In another part of her journals, she says, I want the old me. One of the sobering lessons she confronts is that her experience of cancer means that she'll never be the same person again. I'm so tired of this. I want to be the person I used to be, the real me. Part of growth and transformation involves mourning the people we were. Lorde has to say goodbye to the person she was, the before of her work and habits and ways of being in the world, and move courageously into the unknown of who she's supposed to be. There's no return to normal, but there is necessary mourning and the fearless excavation of this new person, this warrior survival that she's intended to become. And she can't get to this new person until she lets go of who she was. And it raises the question for many of us working during the stresses of the pandemic, what former version of ourselves, of our dreams and aspirations, do we need to release in order to move into new growth? So here we start to get some indication of some of the language that we're going to see a lot, both in Audre Lorde and also Viktor Frankl, who we'll come to in a minute, which is the language of expansion, of mental and imaginative expansion. She makes the paradoxical link that confronting her terror of what having cancer means and articulating those fears both verbally and through her writing restores a sense of power and autonomy. She has a remarkable openness to grappling with her own vulnerability, even when she's not sure that she will be heard or validated. And of course, she talks, one of the forms that this expansion takes is an expansion into a sense of community and belonging with others, an expansion into love. Articulating her unique and evolving reality connects her to community. Most crucially, she draws strength from the many women who come to her support during her illness and recovery. For every ill-tempered nurse or impatient doctor she encounters in a brutal, unfeeling, racist, and misogynist medical system, 1978, she has a friend or family member who affirms her experience, especially her vulnerability, and listens. Most famously, she writes, "In the recognition of the existence of love lies the answer to despair." She reaches for an expanded sense of community in the present moment, and that becomes her strength and her consolation. "My silences have not protected me," she tells us. "One of the most devastating effects of the pandemic has been overwhelm. The tendency to shut down, to retreat from relationship, from community, to hide one's vulnerability behind self-protective defenses. While the experience of cancer and recovery, she recognizes the urgency to find the lessons, no matter how difficult and controversial they are, and to share them with others. Her survival is a roadmap, and she feels this obligation to teach." So one of the things that this kind of underscores for me, thinking about our experience now, is that our own capacity for self-awareness, our innate capacity for growth and for healing, is the most important tool that we have. Two other words that she used that I think are particularly meaningful and applicable. One is this idea of a gateway, of using this experience now as a portal to growth. This idea, again, we see that word expansion. These are only a few streams of insight that flow from the cancer journals. Ideas that resonated with me as I was kind of coping with the ongoing effects of the pandemic on my personal and professional life. And there are three questions I think that this raises that we can kind of take to heart. How have you grown during the long period of constraint and darkness and global upheaval? What are the lessons you can articulate to reclaim a sense of power and agency? And with whom are you sharing that wisdom? And most crucially, as we let go of the past, who is the helper, therapist, counselor, social worker, healer that you are supposed to become through all of this? And I'm going to read this one. "My work is to inhabit the silences with which I have lived and fill them with myself until they have the sound of brightest day and loudest thunder. And then there will be no room left inside of me for what has been, except as memory of sweetness enhancing what can." I can't see the last part of this. So, and that the enhancing the has been except as memory of sweetness. One of the things she underscores, and this is going to connect us to some of the stuff that will come out of Viktor Frankl, is this idea of nostalgia. This idea that we can use memory of who we were as a consolation, that we can't be that person, we can't hold on to a rigid attachment to it, but we can have fond recollections of other times, and that can be a source of sustenance. So Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl wrote from a very different time, place, and demographic location. He was a Jewish psychiatrist from Vienna, Austria. He spent 3 long years in 4 different concentration camps during World War II, during which time his wife and his parents were killed in the same camps. And after his liberation from those camps, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it over a 9-day period. I've read Man's Search for Meaning a number of times. I picked it up again in the tail end of the summer of 2020. Some of you may remember what it was like in the Pacific Northwest then, We had forest fires sending smoke into the Portland area, those of you who are here. We couldn't breathe without imagining carbon particles poisoning our lungs. We were hoping for rain. We didn't have a vaccine yet. Our national political reality was a source of consternation for many of us. So I read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and it was the wisdom of his survival that drew me. He is a psychiatrist in the existential humanist tradition. He's interested in the psychology of suffering. So his focus is not so much on how we heal, but on creative strategies of how we endure. Because you have to remember, for most of the time that he was in the concentration camps, he didn't know if he was going to get out alive. He assumed he wasn't going to get out alive. So this idea of hope and healing wasn't as much on his radar as much as how do we endure the suffering that we are dealt. His story has extraordinary appeal. There have been over 10 million copies sold, and it has urgent relevance for people like us, helping professionals practicing during the pandemic with the economic, racial, and political upheavals that accompanied it. One of the ways in which it particularly resonated with me is Frankl endures a collective trauma that is identical to the humans he is observing, and that's been one of the very tricky things about being a helper during the pandemic, is we're listening to clients talking about things that we ourselves are struggling with, and so we're closer to the emotional reality they're expressing than we're used to being. In Man's Search for Meaning, he also comes to this idea of mental expansion, and he looks at it from a couple different angles. One is in terms of how we experience the presence. He tells the present moment. He tells this story that he's on a transport to the camp, and he looks out of a tiny window, and he can see the natural beauty of the countryside of Salzburg, and this is an actual picture of that. And he talks about the ways in which, in brief glimpses, nature consoles him, but it also concentrates his awareness on the richness of the current moment, of the present, that freed from the dread about the future. And I related to this as we were struggling during the summer of 2020. I remember taking walks with my kids in some of the nearby forests, those forests that were untouched by fires. And even on foggy days, there would be this quiet beauty and the smell of mud and grass. And we would momentarily forget that we were cut off from family and friends, and we were worried about the future. Most of Viktor Frankl's survival strategies involve an imaginative transcendence by force of intellect and will, using his heart and mind to rise above the misery of the here and now. So in one famous passage in Man's Search for Meaning, when the concentration camps guards, their cruelty is extreme, the conditions in the camps are brutally cold, he has an image of his wife from whom he is separated, and he doesn't know if she's alive, but in his mind, he sees her, and she's as real to him in his mind as the cold and the mud and the meanness around him. And here in this quote, he speaks both to the power of love across time and place, but also the consoling appeal of nostalgia and reminiscence as untapped sources of strength. The keenness of his memory, the way nostalgia moves in our bodies, really resonated with me. Again, another personal experience I recall from a different different stage in the pandemic. I was at the grocery store. It was right before the end of senior hour. I'm not a senior, but I was there to jump in as soon as the seniors were done with their grocery shopping. Some workers were controlling the flow of people. Some of them were disinfecting carts. And I wanted to tell them how much I appreciated their efforts when I suddenly caught sight of an old hunched over woman who reminded me of my own grandmother, who was dead, but who throughout my childhood told me stories of surviving the Great Depression, who would have risen to the challenge of the pandemic, even as it would have unnerved her. She was kind of this person who was like very strong and very stubborn, and also someone who worried all the time. And as I thought about trying to say something to the workers who were doing such a heroic job of keeping the environment clean for us, I couldn't get the words out because I had this lump in my throat. And the emotion, that lump in my throat, the emotion, it connected me to her strength of will, mingled with her vulnerability and fears, though that paradox again, that you can have both things can be true at the same time. And over the next months, the image of her, of my grandmother, returned to me, and I saw her again at 75, at 80, with her cream-colored sweater and her cane, and then I saw her again with her walker, as she volunteered at the Red Cross Bloodmobile, determined to the very end of her life to be of service. And it reminded me, and Frankl underscores this, that even when we are alone, we are accompanied. So this idea of kind of an imaginative expansion, a triumph of intellect and heart and will over the misery of current circumstances. Frankl applies this to the past. He applies this to the present moment. He also, there's a type of mental expansion that moves into the future. So another maneuver involves looking at the future, visioning a future beyond the current misery. And Frankl fixes on the dream of the book he's going to write that is going to reach millions. Isn't that fascinating to think about, that was one of the idea of this book that became a reality, was one of the things that sustained him. And I'm going to just read this passage. Remember, this is something that occurs to him while he's in the camps. Suddenly I saw myself standing on the platform of a well-lit, warm, and pleasant lecture room. In front of me sat an attentive audience on comfortable, upholstered seats. I was giving a lecture on the psychology of the concentration camp, and all that oppressed me at that moment became objective, seen and described from the remote viewpoint of science. And I am going to see if we can maybe share this. If I unshare, would you be able to share the video so that we can sort of see how this?
Yes.
Gray hair, my age, I started taking flying lessons recently. Do you know what my flying instructor told me? If you are starting here, wish to get here, say east, heading for this, and you have a crosswind, you will drift and you will land here. So you have to do what we pilots call crabbing, he told me, C-R-A-B, crabbing. You have to head for north of this airfield, and you have to fly that way, you see, as if you headed in this direction. If you are heading here above this airfield, then you will actually land here. But if you head for here, you are landing here. This holds also for man, I would say. If we take man as he really is, we make him worse. But if we overestimate him, it's premature, your applause, you will soon know why. If we seem to be idealists and are overestimating, overrating man, and looking at him that high, here above, you know what happens? We promote him to what he really can be. So we have to be idealists in a way, because then we'll wind up as the real realists. And you know who has said this? If we take man as he is, we make him worse. But if we take man as he should be, we make him capable of becoming what he can be. This was not my flight instructor, this was not me, this was Goethe. He said this verbally. And now you will understand why I, in one of my writings, once said, this is the most apt maxim and motto for any psychotherapeutic activity. So if you don't recognize a young man's will to meaning, man's search for meaning, you make him worse, you make him dull, you make him frustrated, you still add and contribute to his frustration. While if you presuppose in this man, even in this so-called criminal or juvenile delinquent or drug abuse and so forth, there must be a what we call spark, a spark of search for meaning. Let's recognize this, let's presuppose it, and then you will elicit it from him, and you will make him become what he in principle is capable of becoming.
Thank you. I'm going to get my slide up again. Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate the assistance. I love, well, a couple things I love about that. I love hearing his voice, number one. I love hearing his humor and his energy. The quote that he refers to from Goethe, if we take man as he is, we make him worse. But if we take him as he should be, then we make him capable of becoming what he can be, right? And I find this insistence on optimism and hope and idealism, from a man who lost so much during a horrific period. It's very inspiring for us in terms of what we can become coming out of this our own moment in history. When we have to imagine something different in the future. I remember some of you may have read in graduate school or after that, you may have read the psychologist Mary Pfeiffer, right? And I love this quote. She says, she's talking about what it's like to work with clients who have survived traumatic events or overwhelming events and something like that. And she says in very simple words, when something too big for us to handle happens to us, our only healthy response is to grow bigger. What does that mean? I love this idea. Like, what does it mean to grow bigger? To grow bigger. And I think in looking through the writings of just these two writers talking to us from very different experiences, from very different demographic locations, we come across this idea of like mental expansion. And it's not just an expansion that happens in our heads cognitively, but it's also a kind of heart expansion, the ways in which our hearts swell to include other people, real people in our present life, as well as people who speak to us from our past. What does it mean to grow bigger? And in both Audre Lorde and in Viktor Frankl, they talk about a mental expansion that relates to our past, to our nostalgia, to the ways in which nostalgia and our memories and the recognition of who we were, who we had been once, that there can be a consolation in that can be a source of strength. There's also an expanded awareness of the present moment, where our sense of time becomes so localized just to, glimpses of things that are going well for maybe just a few minutes on any given day. I think these positive psychologists who study happiness. I read once that they said we get 45 minutes of happiness a day, so that we are alert to when we get that 45 minutes, and when we get it, we stay with it, we stay very focused on it. And then finally, the last dimension of this mental expansion is thinking about the future, envisioning that person that we're supposed to become once the upheaval or the ordeal or the suffering is over.